Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. As many of you may know, my name is Jacob Francois, a photographer living in the Philadelphia area. Recently, or last week, depending on when I am publishing this video, Matt Day, who is a YouTuber, photographer, father, etc., was in the Philadelphia area, and I got the chance to join a class at Unique Photo when he was just describing how to do photography your way. I'm gonna do a horrible job trying to summarize it, but one of the things that, if I remember correctly, that he talked about was, are you a technical photographer or a creative one? And I think this YouTube video is going to be all around that. Understanding where you fall can help you unlock full potential as an artist, and so let's break it down and find out. Let's start by defining what it means to be a technical photographer. A technical photographer usually focuses on precision. These are all things about gear, setting, sharpness, nailing exposure every time. Think, along the lines of like a product photographer or architecture photographer or interior design photographer or real estate photographer. On the other hand, a creative photographer is always worrying about how can I best tell a story about any and everything. They focus on emotion behind that story. So they're usually breaking the rules, making sure that the lighting is creative enough to highlight what they want to showcase in that story. Now, here's the thing. Both approaches are valid and honest, and most of us fall somewhere in between. So here's a few questions to figure out where you stand on the technical versus the creative photographer. 1, do you prioritize sharpness and perfect exposure over capturing the moment? 2, are you more likely to use the rule of thirds, or do you shoot how you feel in that particular moment in time? 3, do you spend more time researching gear or brainstorming creative ideas for your next shoot? If your answer is yes to the first part, you might lean towards being a technical photographer. If you said no, you're more of a creative type. Remember, this isn't a hard rule or a hard line. It's just a fun way to think about your approach. And I think what we need to do to grow as photographers, especially now that 2024 is ending, and you might be sitting here thinking like, oh, what do I need to do? Or how should I approach my business in 2025, is to start thinking about what type of photographer you are. Sometimes we don't really think about those things, or we don't actually care, for lack of a better term. Yeah. So here's some personal examples from my work. For example, when I'm usually in the studio, I am more technical than creative, even though before I start a shoot, I like to go into Pinterest or go into Instagram and find inspiration to help spark my creativity. But usually I will start off a shoot more on the technical side. I want to make sure I have the 1 or 2 lights. I want to make sure that my ISO is in a certain range. I want to make sure that my aperture is in a certain range because, we want to make sure we capture the moment as cleanly and in focus as humanly possible. I sometimes take product photography photos, and when I do things like that, I'm 100% more technical before I start thinking about the creative or how to change things up to make it more creative or possibly tell a story. That's the same way I'm in the studio. But when I'm in the streets, as many of you may know, I do a lot of street photography. I'm not technical at all. I'm usually auto ISO, auto aperture. I'm lying because I shoot it with a manual focusing lens. So I'm auto ISO, auto shutter speed, depending on the situation. I think that the easiest way to become more of a creative photographer is maybe learning some of the technical aspects. Of course, many people may disagree with me with that, but it's one of those situations like whenever I get a new equipment, I get all into the specs. I get all into figuring out how this new equipment works, how it doesn't work. Sometimes I try to figure out how to break it. I'm just a tech nerd anyway. But for me, the best way for me to be creative is to understand the limitations of what I do own, or the limitations or the pluses or the great things about the equipment that I already own. that feeds my creativity. So for example, when I'm in the streets doing street photography, I'm usually shooting with the Leica M, and when I do so, I usually have it on auto ISO. Also, I'm shooting with a black and white camera, so the grain doesn't bother me at all. And I usually, depending on if I know I'm trying to capture subjects during that time, I will keep it, the shutter speed roughly around 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second. But then if I don't care about subjects in the frame and I'm just capturing whatever I see in the moment, I just usually shoot auto, and I'll keep my f-stop roughly around the 5.6 to 8 because I love zone focusing and it makes life a lot easier. But when I'm in the streets, I'm not really thinking about all outside of just the fact that I just spit out a bunch of technical phrases with you. But when I'm actually in the street, the reason why I shoot in auto is because I don't care what my camera is planning to do when I snap the shutter button. I care about what is in the frame and what type of story or what emotion I'm trying to showcase with that image. So some of you may or may not, if you made it this far into the video, some of you may be asking, how do I grow or how do I challenge myself? So here's some ideas. So if you're more on the technical side, try to break some rules. Experiment with different angles or different lighting sources. For instance, when I was in the studio, or when I am in the studio, I used to rely heavily on strobes. Now I'm more of the continuous types because I also ventured into video. So that difference from strobes to continuous lighting changed the way I shoot, because with strobes, there are very, very powerful strobes out there. And of course, there's powerful continuous lighting out there as well. But to make it more easier and affordable, you're usually at the 300-watt range. And then you learn that sometimes you're probably going to shoot a little bit faster aperture-wise than you would if you're with the strobe. With the strobe, I'm usually at around 4, 5.6, 8. When with the continuous light, I'm usually hovering around 2.8, 3.5 because I don't want to increase my ISO as much because I don't want to include that much grain when I'm in the studio. Of course, it is my creative choice to do this. Well, with the fact that it's okay to be, or the fact that it's also a technical reason, but it is my creative choice when I include grain or not from the camera. If I'm shooting black and white, I don't care. If I'm shooting color, I try to have the least amount of grain as possible. If you're more on the creative side and you still haven't learned your camera or anything like that, maybe take a week or two researching your camera, understanding the cons and pros of that set camera, and try to work within those limitations instead of focusing on just gear, but just work with the gear you currently have and work with those limitations. At the end of the day, there's no right way or wrong way to be a photographer. It's all about what you feel like doing. So this video wasn't really trying to persuade you to be one type of photographer or another photographer. It's just an open dialogue to just show you that even I, who believe I am a creative person, I have a more technical background. So many of you may know I graduated college with an applied mathematics degree. So my thought process is a bit different when it comes to the way my thought process is just different. I usually am a more logical individual. I tend to want to know the ins and outs of certain things. So when I'm shooting in the studio with my Leica SL3, I know that, okay, if I want to capture the best frame without motion blur, I'm going to shoot at 200, 250, 500, depending on my lighting source. But sometimes I don't care and I want to increase that blur, that motion into my frame. So for me personally, I always go back and forth on what type of photographer I am. But if I were to choose one, it really depends on the situation I am in. But if I were to choose one, I think I'm more of a technical photographer than creative, but I'm trying to force myself to become more creative on how I shoot in the studio, how I shoot things outside, or how I tell stories. Well, anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this video. It's a bit of a long one. I think I don't know how long this is going to be, maybe like 5-6 minutes, but I hope you guys listened to what I had to say. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. I hope you learned something from this. Anyway, talk to you guys soon. Peace.